Midnight Call. Michael lived alone in his small apartment in Chicago. He worked at an accounting firm and returned home exhausted every night after a long day. He didn't enjoy living alone, but circumstances didn't allow him to have a roommate. On that cold November night, he was sitting on his couch watching TV when his landline phone suddenly rang. He picked up the receiver and answered in a tired voice. "Hello?" There was no response, just heavy silence. But after a few seconds, he heard a whisper so faint that he could barely make it out. "You're not alone in the house." A chill ran down Michael's spine. He looked around but saw nothing unusual. He hung up, assuming it was just a stupid prank. But he had no idea that this night would be the longest of his life. A few minutes later, while trying to push the unsettling thought out of his mind, he heard a noise coming from the kitchen. Something had fallen to the floor. He hesitated for a moment, then decided to check it out. Grabbing the baseball bat he kept next to the couch, he walked slowly toward the kitchen. The dim light revealed nothing out of place. Everything looked normal. He let out a relieved sigh, but then he heard it again. Click. His landline phone had been picked up again. Michael turned sharply and stared at the phone resting on the table. The receiver was off the hook, as if someone were holding it. Yet, he was alone. Slowly, he stepped closer and put the receiver to his ear. The whisper returned. "I'm behind you." Michael froze, his heart pounding violently. He could feel something standing behind him, watching him. In a split-second move, he spun around and swung the bat, but there was no one there. The kitchen was empty. Then he noticed it. The window was open, even though he was absolutely certain he had locked it hours ago. Trembling, he slammed it shut and locked it tightly. He tried convincing himself that he was imagining things, but his body refused to stop shaking. Determined to sleep and forget this nightmare, he walked toward his bedroom, only to stop dead in his tracks. His closet door was slightly open, and he knew for a fact that he had shut it that morning. He stood frozen, staring at it, when he noticed something inside. A pair of glowing eyes staring back at him from the darkness. His breath quickened. He wanted to move away, but his body refused. Then the closet door creaked open a little more. A long black hand slowly reached out toward him. Michael couldn't scream. He couldn't even run. The thing that had been hiding in his apartment all night had finally come out. The next morning, neighbors found Michael's apartment door open, but the place was completely empty. He had vanished without a trace. Yet, every night at midnight, the landline phone continued to ring. The Man with the Wide Smile. Ethan was a university student living in a small apartment near campus. He wasn't particularly social and spent most of his nights at the library, buried in books until the late hours. One cold November night, he stayed later than usual, not realizing the time until it was past 2 a.m. He left the library, and an eerie silence surrounded him. The streets were empty, and the dark buildings loomed over him like silent watchers. Shoving his hands deep into his pockets to keep warm, he walked briskly toward his apartment. But after just a few steps, he felt something strange, a creeping sensation that he wasn't alone. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw nothing, yet the feeling of being watched clung to him. At the street corner, he spotted a man standing under a flickering streetlight. He was tall, dressed in an elegant black suit, his face partially hidden in the shadows, except for one thing, a wide smile stretching from ear to ear. It wasn't a normal smile, it was rigid, unnaturally wide, as if carved into his face. Ethan felt his stomach twist, but he convinced himself it was just a strange passerby. He ignored the man and quickened his pace, but as he moved, so did the man. Yet, he wasn't walking. He was gliding silently over the pavement, his feet never touching the ground, moving at the exact same speed as Ethan. Ethan's breath quickened. He picked up his pace. The man did too. He wasn't chasing him. He was mirroring him. By the time Ethan reached his apartment building, his hands were trembling. He fumbled for his keys, but they slipped from his fingers and clattered to the ground. When he looked up, the man was closer. Now Ethan could see him clearly. His skin was ghostly pale, almost ashen, and his eyes, pure black voids, empty and soulless. But the worst part was the smile. It wasn't just a grin, it was too wide, stretching beyond human limits, as if his face had been forcibly torn at the corners. For a moment, the man's empty eyes gleamed with something sinister. Ethan shoved the key into the lock, twisted it frantically and pushed the door open. He threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. Pressing his back against it, he panted heavily, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. After a few seconds, he gathered the courage to peer through the peephole. Nothing. The street was empty. The man was gone. Ethan exhaled shakily, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? He convinced himself it was exhaustion playing tricks on him. But as he turned toward the stairs, he froze. At the end of the dimly lit hallway, the man with the wide smile was standing inside the building. Ethan's breath hitched. He didn't move, neither did the man. Then something horrifying happened. His mouth began to open, not in a normal way. His jaw stretched downward, widening more and more, far beyond what should have been possible, until his mouth became an abyss of pure darkness. Ethan bolted. He ran up the stairs, reached his apartment and slammed the door shut behind him. He locked every bolt, pressed his back against the wood and listened. For a moment, nothing. Then a soft knock and a whisper. Deep, cold. "Why did you leave me outside?" Ethan's lungs froze. He didn't answer. He didn't move. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Finally, he convinced himself that the danger had passed. He crept toward the door, pressing his ear against it. Nothing. Taking a deep breath, he slowly turned the handle and cracked the door open. The hallway was empty, but there was something on the wall across from his apartment door. Something that hadn't been there before. Scratch marks, deep, jagged scratches, carved into the wall with what looked like bare fingers. The marks formed a wide, sinister smile. The next morning, Ethan was gone. No trace of him was ever found, but everyone who moved into his apartment after him would wake up in the middle of the night to a whisper from behind their door. "Why did you leave me outside?" The child in the closet town. The house was spacious and suspiciously cheap, but they didn't question it too much. They were looking for a fresh start after the birth of their daughter, Laylee. From the very first night, Adam noticed something strange. The wooden closet door in the master bedroom would open on its own at exactly 2:33 a.m. every night. At first, he thought it was just a faulty latch or a draft, but even after securing it tightly, he would always find the closet door open every morning. But then things got worse. One evening, while Sarah was washing dishes, she heard Layla laughing alone in her room. When she went to check, she found her sitting on the floor smiling as she stared toward the open closet. "Who were you talking to, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently. Layla looked up at her mother and said innocently, "The boy who lives here, in the closet." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, but she convinced herself that her daughter was just imagining things. But that night, the family woke up to the sound of muffled crying coming from inside the closet. Adam stood in front of it, his heart pounding. He reached for the handle, hesitated for a moment, then yanked the door open. Nothing. The closet was completely empty. He thought it was just exhaustion playing tricks on him, but Layla was standing behind him, whispering, "He ran away now, but he'll be back tonight." His first appearance. At exactly 2:33 a.m., Adam woke up to the sound of tiny footsteps running down the hallway. He sat up quickly, expecting to see Layla awake, but then he froze. Layla was fast asleep in her bed. So, who was running? At the bedroom door, he saw a small shadow of a child. He couldn't make out the features, but the figure just stood there staring at him. And as Adam moved toward it, the child suddenly ran straight into the closet and slammed the door shut. When Adam opened the closet, no one was inside. But this time, he noticed something chilling. Scratches on the inside walls as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. The terrifying truth. The next day, Sarah decided to research the history of the house. When she found the old archives, she uncovered a horrifying truth. 20 years ago, a young boy named Jacob had disappeared inside this very house. His mother said he had been playing hide and seek when he entered the closet and never came out. The police searched every inch of the house but never found him. But the strangest part was an old newspaper article. Every family that had lived in the house after Jacob's disappearance had reported seeing a strange child running at night before vanishing into the closet. Adam and Sarah didn't hesitate for a second. The very next day, they packed their bags and left the house for good. But on their last night, as Adam carried Layla to the car, she whispered in his ear, "Daddy, Jacob says he's going to miss me." And from that day on, the closet door in that house continued to open at exactly 2:33 a.m., waiting for a new guest. The knocking on the window. On a stormy night, darkness engulfed the old university dormitory. Amy sat at her desk surrounded by piles of books and scattered notes. Her eyes were weary from studying, her ears catching the howling wind outside, accompanied by the creaking branches tapping against the window. Rumors circulated among the students about this particular building, whispers of strange noises and ghostly apparitions in the hallways. But Amy didn't believe in superstitions, or at least that's what she told herself. As she buried herself in her notes, a faint knocking echoed from the window. She looked up cautiously but saw nothing. Convincing herself it was just a tree branch, she returned to her studies. But the knocking came again, louder this time. She approached the window slowly, her eyes fixed on the rain-soaked glass. At first, she saw nothing, but as she looked closer, a cold shiver ran down her spine. There were long, unnatural fingerprints sliding slowly down the glass, as if something was trying to get in. She quickly backed away, her hands trembling as she yanked the curtains shut. Sitting on her bed, she tried to calm her racing heart. But the knocking returned, this time from inside the room. Her eyes darted around in fear. The room was empty, but she felt an unseen presence, like eyes watching her from the shadows. She tried to convince herself she was just tired and imagining things. Then she heard it, a cold, chilling whisper echoing from within the walls. "Open the window! Let me in!" Amy froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, drawn out, and filled with anger. She bolted toward the door, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't budge, as if an invisible force was holding it shut. The room grew colder and colder, her breath fogging up the air, hanging as a faint mist. Suddenly the curtains began to move on their own, slowly rising to reveal the window once more. This time, it wasn't just fingerprints. There were pale, distorted faces pressed against the glass, their hollow eyes staring at Amy. Their mouths were open, screaming silently. Then the faces moved. They passed through the glass without breaking it, crawling into the room, scaling the walls and ceiling, their wails echoing in the air. Amy backed into a corner, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face from sheer terror. One of the faces, that of a disfigured woman, leaned in close and whispered coldly, "You should have opened the window. You should have let us in." The faces surrounded her, swirling around her like a vortex of cold shadows. The last thing Amy felt was an overwhelming, bone-chilling cold before everything faded into darkness. The next morning, when her roommate came to check on her, she found the window wide open, icy air filling the room. Amy was sitting on her bed, her eyes wide open, but she was cold as ice and no longer breathing. On the bathroom mirror, a message was written in cold mist. "We finally got in."